Hi guys, and welcome to the Tissue PowerPoint lecture. I hope you guys are enjoying this class so far, and if you have any questions at the end, feel free to contact me. All right, so the first thing that we're going to start talking about are a few definitions. So remember that when we talked about this sort of structural hierarchy, we went from this chemistry aspect with talking about atoms and molecules. Then we talked about the cells, and now we're going to start thinking about tissues. So a tissue by definition is a group of similar cells with a common function. So make sure you know the difference between a cell and a tissue for sure. And when we study tissues, this is called histology. If you see the term histo, like a histogram or histology, this is referring to tissues. And logy means the study of. So keep that in mind in terms of like Greek and Latin origin. But there are four major types of tissues in the body, and I do want to make sure you know the four major types. We're going to start by talking about epithelial tissue, which we tend to think about as like our coverings or our linings. We have connective tissue, which is going to be connecting things together. So we'll talk about cartilage. We're going to talk about ligaments and bone and blood. And then we talk about muscle tissue. Muscle tissue we think about as being able to contract and being able to allow for movement. But we not only talk about skeletal muscle here, we're going to talk about what actually makes up your heart, the cardiac muscle, as well as smooth. And then finally, we'll end talking about nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is going to allow for cell-to-cell communication, allow for messages to go from one area to another. And we'll get into more detail about that in just a moment. But again, make sure you know the four major types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. All right, so starting with our epithelial tissue, these are the general characteristics and functions. And what I'd like you to know is, again, if it's highlighted in red, it's probably something very important that you may be asked about. So I'm going to ask you a lot about epithelial tissue. One thing is that it covers your organs and body surfaces. So again, when we think about our skin, that's made up and composed of epithelial tissue, at least the superficial aspect. It also helps to line cavities as well as our hollow organs too. It does make up some of our glands. So when we talk about like our sebaceous glands, which help us to produce oil, or our sweat glands, again, that's going to be made up with epithelial tissue. Now, one thing that's very important to think about when we start looking at these tissue slides is that they're going to have a free surface, meaning that it's not going to be attached to anything. And that's going to be on the outside of the cell, versus the inside of the cell is going to have this anchor called the basement membrane. So for instance, this is going to be a type of tissue we see. It is called the simple squamous epithelium. And so what you'll see is that there's this anchor that we refer to as the basement membrane. In some textbooks, they'll refer to it as the basal lamina, but we're going to refer to it as the basement membrane. But this is going to be the anchor. And then on the outside of the cell, we're going to see that it's pretty free and not attached to anything. And so simple squamous or simple squamous are sort of flat cells. And this is sort of if we were looking at it as a side profile. They're nice and kind of flat, and then they have a nuclei that we sort of can see. But again, they have a free side on the outside, so that it's not attached to anything. And then again, we have this basement membrane that's going to anchor it to something below it. So whatever this may be. So there's a free side, and then there's this anchored basement membrane that'll anchor to pretty much another tissue. Now, one thing to keep in mind with epithelial tissue is it lacks blood vessels. So we refer to this as being avascular. So as a kid, you may have put little bobby pins in your fingers, or like at least from the superficial aspect of your fingers, or maybe you got a paper cut that didn't bleed, because if you're on the superficial aspect, you're using epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue does not have blood vessels, so therefore it's not going to bleed. So what happens is the fact that the nutrients actually have to diffuse from underlying tissues and move their way up in order to give them those proper nutrients. And so we'll start talking about this when it comes to the skin. The more superficial you go, the actually keratinized and dead cells that are there because of the fact they just don't get that proper oxygenation and they don't get that proper nutrients, so they don't survive. But we'll talk more about that in the next week or so. Another thing to keep in mind with epithelial tissue is it's constantly dividing. And whenever there's an injury, it actually heals pretty quickly. Your skin's pretty quick to heal, as well as your linings are pretty quickly to heal. And the cells are very tightly close together. So we call it tightly packed. Now, when we think about epithelial tissue, one thing is to know how we classify them. We classify them based upon their shapes as well as their number of layers. So in terms of shapes, there are 3 potential shapes you could see. Squamous or squamous is flat, cuboidal is going to be a cube shape, and columnar is going to be tall. So with the squamous or squamous, again, you're going to think about it as being more of a flat cell. With cuboidal, it's going to be a cube shape, and then columnar is going to be long and tall. A little more narrow. Now with layers, this is pretty easy. If you have only one layer, it's going to be simple. Anything over 1 will be considered to be stratified. So if it has 2 layers, it's going to be stratified. If it has 25 layers, it's going to be stratified. So you can end up with simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. Or you can have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar. If it's 1 layer, it's simple. If it's stratified, it's more than 1 layer. And then we have a little bit of a trickster here, the pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue. And pseudo means false or fake. So what happens here is it looks like it's more than 1 layer, but it's actually not. So it will be a truly simple, but it doesn't appear so. So that's why we call it pseudo-stratified. It's kind of like a fake looking more than 1 layer. So the first tissue that we're going to look at is the simple squamous. Simple squamous is going to be simple, meaning it's 1 layer, and squamous, meaning it's flat. So it's a single layer of flat cells. And remember, here structure greatly relates to function. If it's nice and thin and flat, it's going to be used for diffusion so that gas molecules can easily move. So this is great for something called the alveoli in your lungs to allow for gas exchange, as well as for capillaries in your blood. And again, we can also see it lining our blood vessels as well as our lymphatic vessels. So very thin, very delicate, allows for diffusion to take place as well as filtration. And so when we look at these pictures here, this one is sort of if you were looking down on it. You can see that they're really closely packed together. This is the free surface that's not attached to anything. And then in this picture here, again, we can also see that free surface, as well as then we can see this basement membrane underneath where it's actually anchored down to a tissue. And down here, it's actually going to be anchored to a connective tissue. We'll talk more about that connective tissue coming up. But again, you'll see a free layer that's not attached to anything, this basement membrane that's sort of anchoring it. And then again, we'll see a tissue below that's sort of bringing everything together. Next, we have simple cuboidal. So again, simple tells you that it's 1 layer. Cuboidal tells you that it's cube shape. And so when you go to see these guys, again, you see this 1 layer, you'll see the nuclei are pretty much in the middle. And here, again, it's going to look a little bit different. This is the free surface. And then again, we can see that basement membrane out here that's taking place. But this free surface in the middle, we refer to as the lumen. Because of its shape, it's better for secretion. So actually allowing us to secrete, so being able to sort of produce or move things, and then also to absorb as well. And this is going to help to line kidney tubules. It helps to cover ovaries. It actually is very useful in thyroid follicles, and it lines some ducts as well. Next, we have the simple columnar. So this is going to be a single layer. And again, you can see that these are very tall, narrow cells. So they're column shaped. When you look at their free surface, on the top, you're going to see that it kind of looks like they have little hairs. They may have hair, which is the cilia, or they may have something called microvilli, depending on their location. When we go to look at their nucleus, so remember each cell has to have a nucleus, they're pretty much at the same level, but they're going to be closer to that basement membrane, that anchoring portion. And then again, on the free surface, we're either going to see these cilia or we're going to see these microvilli. Now, if they have cilia, more than likely they're going to have these goblet cells. And these goblet cells are helpful to secrete mucus. So some areas where you're going to find mucus are actually in the uterus to allow for that, that mucus plug. We have the stomach actually produce mucus as well to help for protection of the stomach lining, as well as our intestines too. So this is a great area to see in your digestive system, as well as in the reproductive system. And again, if they have goblet cells, you're going to see those little cilia on top. Then we have our trickster one. Now, I love this picture here because it makes it so much easier to see from the illustration as well as from the microscopy, the actual microscope side. So pseudo means false and stratified means more than one layer. So it looks like it's more than one layer, but really, if you look at the picture of the illustration, they're all actually attached to that basement membrane. So it's only one layer. And their cells kind of vary in shape. Like I said, if you see the cilia on top, you're also going to see goblet cells. Goblet cells help to secrete mucus. And where pseudostratified becomes very useful and the location-wise, it's very good for protection from infection. So we tend to find these in our respiratory passages to allow us to expel that mucus when we cough and be able to remove irritants, as well as to remove any unwanted antigens or bacteria, something along those lines. And here we can see those goblet cells pretty well. So this is a goblet cell. And again, their function is to help produce mucus. And then again, up here, we can see the cilia. All right, now we're moving on to stratified. So stratified means that it's more than one layer. So again, if we've seen the stratified squamous, think of this as being our skin. This is going to be if it's keratinized, which we'll talk more about keratinized next week, but I just want to make mention of it right now. There's many layers. And if you think about it, it's going to be very protective because it has so many layers. So our skin is extremely protective because it has several layers to it. And you'll see that they actually kind of look a little bit more cube the deeper they go, and the higher up you go, the more superficial you're moving, the more they start to look like they're flat. And again, a lot of this has to do with the fact that when we think about our skin, actually the top layers are truly dead. They're not actually living cells because again, they're avascular. They don't have any blood vessels. So they're getting all their nutrients from underlying tissues, but that only goes so far. So all these layers, they're all dead. And the new cells actually push from the older cells. So they're kind of pushing their way and sloughing their way up. So again, we tend to think about this as our skin, but it also helps us to align our oral cavity, again, where we need that protection, the vagina as well, and the anal canal, where you're going to have more protective layers, you'll have more abrasion. So we need to be able to have stronger, thicker layers. In stratified cuboidal, more than likely, you're not going to see more than 2 or 3 layers versus with stratified squamous. If you see all these layers, it's pretty intense and it kind of gives you that very clear, okay, this is what it looks like. Versus with stratified cuboidal, more than likely, you're not seeing more than 2 or 3 layers. And again, they're going to be that square shape or cube-like shape. It's going to have a little bit more protection than just one layer. So this tends to help the line ducts as well as some of our glands. And then finally, we talk about our stratified columnar. Our stratified columnar, what's going to happen is the top layer is more elongated versus the deeper layers that are anchored to that basement membrane tend to look a little bit more cube-like. Some things that we can find here is like the male urethra. We can also find this in some of our exocrine glands like the pancreas, but I won't be asking you location for this one. And then the last epithelial tissue that we're going to talk about is transitional. It's made up of many layers. It's going to be cube shaped. And it's going to change depending on tension. If it's going to stretch, it's going to be because of increased tension. So in the figure A and B, we can see what it looks like if it's stretched versus when it's not stretched. When it's stretched, again, it actually is going to change the shape, and you'll notice that they're sort of more close together. So this is going to be like what we would find in the urinary bladder, and it's going to change shape depending on how much urine content or how much urine volume we have. When you are holding on to lots of urine, it's going to be more in that stretched leg condition. Versus if you're going to be relaxed and you've just expelled all those contents, you'll be in that more relaxed stage. So you can see those differences there. All right, moving on to the next major class. We just got through epithelial tissue. Now we're talking about connective tissue. Connective tissue is going to be the most abundant. And when we think about these cells, they're not on top of each other. As we've seen before with our histology slides, we noticed that epithelial cells are very, very close together. We're not going to see that with our connective tissue. But there are some functions I need you to know, because again, this is kind of a crazy assortment, if you will, of different types of cells and tissues. So they bind structures together. So this is what we're going to think about, like our tendons and our ligaments, and even like for bone, providing support and framework. Bone is actually a connective tissue. It helps us to fill spaces, and it helps us to store fat. So when we talk about fat cells, we refer to it as adipose tissue. And so that's what we'll see here. It also helps us to produce blood cells. So believe it or not, blood is actually a connective tissue as well. So when we think about our blood, this can be red blood cells or white blood cells. So it can help protect against infections. And it can also help with repairing of tissue damage, because we actually have other cells within our blood called platelets that are very useful. Now, one thing to keep in mind with these cells, again, they're further apart and they contain what's called a matrix. And this matrix is going to have different fibers and different substances, and they can be either a solid, or they can be a semi-solid, or they can be a fluid. So if you think about, for these guys here, imagine that you have certain cells, and again, they're going to be further apart. And then in the matrix portion, we can find different fibers, we can find different substances. And again, depending on what we're looking at, this can be a solid, this can be kind of a semi-solid, or it can be a liquid or a fluid. So like, for instance, you could have a solid like bone, or you could have a fluid like your blood. Usually with connective tissue, they have good blood supply, but when we think about them being well nourished, again, this kind of depends, and depending on the vascular system, it can be a little bit different depending on the type of tissue we're looking at. And most of these cells do divide. All right, so thinking about some of those fibers that we find in this extracellular matrix. So again, we have the cells, and then what's outside of the cells is this matrix that we're thinking about. So we could potentially find fibers like collagen fibers, which are going to be useful for where you need very high levels of strength and flexibility. So like in our ligaments and tendons, ligaments link bone to bone, muscles in bone are linked together by tendons. So tendons are muscle to bone, ligaments are like ligaments, they link bone to bone. And so in this more of a black and white format, we can see collagen fibers. So collagen fibers, again, allow for lots of strength and some flexibility. In yellow, we see our elastic fibers. And these are going to help for stretching and returning to their original shape. So if you think about like an elastic band, you can stretch it out really far and it will go back to its original shape. So usually when we think of there being places where there's a lot of elastic fibers, our vocal cords, where there's going to be some stretching and then they have to be able to recoil very easily, as well as our respiratory passages. And then finally, what we're not able to see in this figure are reticular fibers. This is more found in like the liver and spleen, and they actually are thin branches of collagen that form this giant supportive network and help for more of the framework, as well as for helping for connections. So again, we tend to find those in the spleen and in the liver. Now, to sort of break down to make this easy of what is found within connective tissue, not that this part is easy, this actually to me is the most confusing part, is sort of knowing where they're found. But we can see some of these loose connective tissues, and then we can find some dense connective tissues as well as specialized ones. For me personally, the ones I'm going to ask you are adipose. I may ask you about dense regular, some elastic, and then these guys here. Those are going to be the ones I ask. I really don't ask about areolar. I will talk about areolar when we talk about skin, and I will talk about dense irregular when we talk about skin. But for right now, these are kind of the ones to expect. So what I would suggest doing is knowing some major components about them, sort of what are some examples and what gives them their characteristics. So I've told you I'm not too worried about areolar connective tissue. This is actually going to be underneath the epithelial tissue. So when we are talking about like the simple squamous, and there's that basement membrane, and there's this like anchoring to another tissue, that's our areolar connective tissue that we're thinking about. So in this picture, you can see that there are cells, and then there's these ground substances. The cells that we actually see are called fibroblasts. And the other stuff is just the extracellular matrix. So there's collagen fibers to allow for some flexibility and some strength. There's elastic fibers that allow for that stretching and recoiling to take place. Then we move on to adipose tissue. And I want you to be able to identify adipose tissue. This is going to help us to store fat. Adipocytes are actually our fat cells. And so they push their nuclei to one side. So you'll see that the nuclei are kind of off in the side. And what they're doing is they're actually cushioning and insulating. So when we think about where adipose tissue is found, it's beneath your skin, it's behind your eyeballs, it's around your heart and your kidneys. Believe it or not, they actually have lots of fat surrounding them, and in between spaces that are going to be found where muscles are. So wherever you're going to see that there's sort of a space that needs to be filled, or again, some heavy protection, we think about adipose tissue. And when you go to look at the picture of adipose tissue, like when we think about these fat cells, these fat droplets, the way I always remember is that it sort of looks like Jiffy Pop, or the Jiffy, the white marshmallow fluff. My dad always said it looked like turkey droplets, like if you had like turkey oil, but I like my Jiffy Jif marshmallow. I think it just looks more like that. So helps me to remember it. Again, we have our reticular fibers and our reticular connective tissues. So to kind of give you a better picture, this is those reticular fibers I was talking about that are thin collagen fibers. And again, they help to support our internal organs and make that framework. So this is where we find it on the liver and the spleen. For dense regular connective tissue, this is going to be what composes our tendons and ligaments. They don't have a great blood supply. So if you don't have great blood supply, it takes you a longer time to heal. So if someone has like a tendon tear or a ligament tear, it can be months to even a year before they have proper healing. But you're going to see that there's lots of collagen fibers. So again, because there's a lot of collagen fibers all very well webbed together, it's very strong. And so it withstands a lot of pulling. And so this is going to help to bind parts together. So again, it helps you to link muscle to bone in that tendon, and it helps us to link bone to bone with our ligaments. In dense irregular connective tissue, this is more of collagen fibers that are sort of randomly composed and woven together. And the reason that this is useful for skin is because it actually helps you to have tension in different directions. So that's what allows for a lot of bending and twisting and lots of range of motion to take place. So usually we find this around our skin and around our skeletal muscles. Now, thinking about elastic connective tissue, again, we're going to see a lot of elastic fibers. And so this is going to help us to make up some large airways, large arteries, parts of the heart. And again, because of the fact that it has a lot of elastic fibers, it allows for lots of stretching and recoil to take place. All right, next we're going to be moving on to cartilage. And cartilage is going to be a very specialized connective tissue. So now we're moving into those specialized connective tissues. When we think about cartilage, it actually is the model for our developing bone. We'll talk more about that here in just in a few weeks when we start talking about the skeletal system. It's going to be protection for our underlying tissue, and it can also be framework as well. When we think about the cells that are made up of the cartilage, we have something called chondrocytes. Chondro means cartilage, and then cytes means cells. So these are our cartilage cells. And they're found in these little hollow chambers called the lacuna, which is surrounding the matrix, or surrounded by the matrix, I apologize. Again, cartilage does not heal very well, and one of the reasons it doesn't heal very well or it takes a long time to heal is because they don't really have a great blood supply. But they're covered by this structure called the perichondrium, and it's made up of connective tissue, and that helps to give some nutrients to the cartilage because, again, if they don't have their own good blood supply or they don't have a blood supply, they needed to get it from other areas. And so cartilage will get their blood supply by this perichondrium. And there are 3 types of cartilage. You have hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Now, we also have hyaline cartilage, and hyaline cartilage is the most common type of cartilage. So when you go to look at this picture again, you see the chondrocytes, those cartilage cells. And again, they have like a sort of like a little halo around them that's sort of dark. That channel or that space is called a lacuna. And then they have this extracellular matrix. So hyaline cartilage tends to make up the ends of our bones. It helps to make up our nose, and it helps to make up our respiratory passages. Then we have the elastic cartilage. And elastic cartilage, again, you see those chondrocytes, you'll see the lacuna, but now in this extracellular matrix, we see a lot of elastic fibers. So again, elastic fibers allows for that stretch and recoil. So when you think about your ear or you think about your larynx, like your vocal cords, that's where we're going to be finding it. And then last, we have something called fibrocartilage. And so what we'll see here is that they have a lot of collagen fibers. Again, you'll still see those chondrocytes. And when I look at the chondrocytes, it makes me think of green eggs and ham. I don't know why, but it does. But you'll see the chondrocytes. You'll see that they're found in their little lacuna, their little channel or their chamber. And fibrocartilage is very tough because, again, it has a lot of collagen fibers. It makes it very tough and makes it very durable. So it's a great shock absorber. And some of the places that we'll find it are in between our vertebrae, in something called our IV discs. We find it in our knee pads as well as in our pelvic girdle, places where you need a lot of shock absorbance. And again, lots of toughness, lots of durability because of those collagen fibers that we find. Our next specialized type of connective tissue is going to be our bone tissue. This is the most rigid type of connective tissue. It has a solid matrix, and so it has lots of minerals and salts found within it. When we think about bone, we think about it being able to provide structures, a framework. It helps with protection. But again, it actually does a lot more than that. It helps us to produce our blood cells. So when we think about our bone marrow, it helps us to store and release different minerals like calcium and phosphorus. It actually creates an attachment site for our muscles, and it helps us to form our skeleton. So bone does a lot. There are a lot of different functions to bone, and I'd greatly suggest that you know them. And it does contain something called osteocytes. Now, when you hear the term osteo means bone and cyte means cell. And they also are found within a chamber called the lacuna. So you'll see that there's the bone cell, and they're trapped in these little chambers called lacunae. Now, when we think about bone, there's 2 types of bone. There's a compact bone, which is nice and hard and durable. And then there's also a spongy bone, which we're going to find, which is going to actually look like a sponge. Kind of cool. The compact bone that we think about is very strong and durable. It has a deposit of this really strong matrix. And again, it has multiple layers to it called the lamellae. You don't have to know that for this time around. We're going to be talking about that in the skeletal system. Next, we think about our osteons, and osteons are actually sort of this cylindrical unit of the bone itself, and it helps us to form compact bone. Again, not going to test you on it for this test, but we will be bringing it up in the future. So if you want to learn about it now, you can. When we start to see this circular aspect here, that's an osteon. In the middle, there's this canal that allows for blood flow. And again, we see these layers and these rings of deposit, which we call the lamellae. And right here, again, you can actually see this osteocyte, this bone cell, and it's sitting in this chamber called the lacuna. All right, our next specialized type of connective tissue is going to be blood. And I believe this is the last one. I think we covered all the other bases. Blood is going to have a fluid matrix that's actually going to be called plasma. And inside, you're going to see red blood cells, white blood cells, and something called platelets. Now, the red blood cells are going to be these biconcave shapes. They kind of look like little donuts when you go to see them. You have the white blood cells, which are going to stain purple. And red blood cells help with transporting of gases. Our white blood cells actually help with immunity and helping defend it against infection, which I do want you to know. Platelets help with blood clotting. And what happens is this allows us to transport substances around the body. So again, it helps us to get out our gases, helps us to get rid of our waste, as well as bringing nutrients to tissues. So I do want you to know quite a lot about blood. This should pretty much all be in red. All right, that was the end of connective tissue. Next, we're going to talk about muscle tissues. And so muscle tissue is going to be where we're thinking about muscle fibers. Our muscle cells are actually referred to muscle fibers. It's going to be contractile, so it can shorten and lengthen depending on if we're actually contracting or if we're relaxing. And there are three types of muscle tissue. We have skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. First, we'll talk about skeletal muscle tissue. So this is going to be attached to bones. This is what allows for your movements to take place, like if you were throwing a ball, or if you were running, or if you were talking. One thing that we see about it is that it has these striations, and those striations are like stripes. So it looks like corduroy pants when you go to see it. They have these nice, perfect stripes, or what we refer to as striations. And when we talk about muscle movement, skeletal muscle is going to be voluntary, meaning we control the movement. We choose to talk. We choose to throw a ball. We choose to kick the TV and accidentally hurt our toe. And hopefully we don't do that, but you get the idea. It's voluntary movements. And what we'll see inside these muscle cells or these muscle fibers is there's more than one nuclei. So it's multinucleated. And skeletal muscle is actually stimulated by our nerve cells. Our nerve cells are what allow for this movement to take place. Again, we have voluntary movement. We choose to move it, but it's stimulated by nerve cells to actually allow for that to take place. Now, with smooth muscle, it is not striated at all, so you don't see those stripes at all. Their spindle fibers look a little bit different. With skeletal muscle, they're elongated. With spindle fibers, they look, or with smooth muscle, they kind of look like spindle fibers when you go to see them. And they have involuntary movements, meaning we do not have control whether or not these contract or relax. So where we're going to find these guys are in our eyes when we think about our pupils dilating. They make up walls of hollow organs, our blood vessels. So when we think about like our GI tract, our stomach and our small intestine and large intestine, we have no control over that. So that's going to be composing of smooth muscle. So anywhere where you have kind of involuntary movement, that's not the heart, it's going to be composed of smooth muscle. And then the last but not least, we have our cardiac muscle tissue. This is only found in the wall of the heart. So this makes it pretty easy. You will see that it is striated. So it does have those stripes to it. But they're actually going to have branching cells that we're going to see. And what we'll also notice too is that you'll see kind of these little kind of cuts, if you will, within the cell. These are called intercalated discs. And we're not going to really discuss the function here right this moment, but it helps with actually allowing the heart to contract. So these are called intercalated discs. So again, it's only found in the walls of the heart. It is involuntary movement. We have no control whether our heart contracts or not. It is striated. And again, we're going to see those intercalated discs. So I would suggest with the muscle tissue, which ones are voluntary and involuntary, what do they look like? Do they have striations? And just kind of where they're found. All right, and last tissue to talk about is our nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is going to be found in the brain, our spinal cord, and our nerves. And the main cells are called neurons. This is what allows for communication to take place. So when you have an impulse go from your brain to your toe, that's going to be using neurons. And so we have some that are great for sensory. So when we smell, when we taste, when we feel, and then we have some that allow for motor control. So again, while we're able to kick a ball or while we're able to lift our hand off of a hot stove, that's because of these neurons. So we have sensory aspect to it, and then we also have a motor aspect to it as well. And so neurons are going to coordinate, they're going to integrate, and again, they regulate some of our body functions. And then finally, to support neurons, so when we think of nervous tissue, again, we think of the main cell being neurons, but the neurons actually have to be nourished and supported. They're supported by something called neuroglia or neuroglia. And when we think of neuroglia, glia means glue. So they help to support the neurons by basically being their glue. So they're supporting and nourishing the neurons and keeping them together. So when we go to look at this guy here, this guy in yellow is our neuron. So again, it has lots of these processes coming off. These guys are picking up the information, sending it to the cell, and then they're going to send it out to different parts of the body. Versus these neuroglia or neuroglia are going to actually protect the neuron. And again, they're attached to it. They're actually supporting it and nourishing it. So again, think about that glial as being glue, the neuroglial cells. All right, that's all I have for you guys for today. I hope you're doing well. And if you have any questions, like I said, feel free to reach out. Bye, guys.